So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this is something a little bit different. This is obviously a much shorter battle. At least the first part of this little double series is going to be a shorter battle because this is a little tug of war event which took place over the course of two battles, like I said, and it starts off with a bit more of a field battle here, and the question to be asked here is who is going to make the better allies for the elves? Is it going to be the dwarves or the Numenorians, neither of which will let the elves down too much in terms of quality? But the first of these two battles is actually a very weird one because the level of quality on display from both sides is really just limited to their very basic units, which I find a little bit weird. The setup for the first of these two battles is certainly quite strange, but the reason why I'm doing this is to try and make sure that my schedule is nice and padded out over the Xmas break, where I won't be able to record on my PC because I won't have access to it. So I'm just recording this last one basically before I leave the flats to go and catch my train, and obviously how very typical. Of course I get interrupted by a phone call right now. It could have happened all day, but no, as I was saying, I have a train to catch, and that means a longer battle replay will not be suitable, albeit the second of the battles in this little two-part series, Tug of War, is a significantly longer battle, and it does take place on a siege map. And it is going to be of Elven origin, but which of the two Elven factions are going to be on the defence when we get there? We shall have to wait and see, but for the time being we'll go through, well, considering it's a field battle, I suppose we will go through the blue team, who we're viewing this battle from the perspective of, starting off with Grimlock here, who's playing as the dwarves of Erebor. As far as basic units go, really, Numenorians, elves and dwarves should be fairly well off, even if they have to make do with their standard units. So we've got the Ironfoot Warriors here on the front, and as far as a standard lineup unit goes, they should be fairly decent, especially considering it looks like they're going to be facing off against primarily Balagaya units. So the axes on these dwarves should be able to bite and hit home relatively easily, and the armour piercing on the Dwarven Miners, considering the relatively low quality of the units overall, again, should actually be fairly useful. It's all relative after all, and usually we see the level of quality, especially where these factions are concerned, enter the stratosphere, but seeing as that is not the case this time around, it's a very, very odd battle, this one, to start off this two-part series. I'm not sure what the initial rules were, but it is what it is. Dwarven Miners here. And they've also got cavalry. I don't know if any of the other factions on display have actually got cavalry, but mercenary cavalry is honestly pretty terrible in the game at the moment because they have all of the hallmarks of a unit which doesn't tend to do well in the current meta of the game. They're a melee cavalry unit, so they're not particularly good off the charge. Melee cavalry that's single HP in general is not even that good at being melee cavalry. Mercenaries have got terrible morale overall, so when they charge in they have a tendency to rout very quickly against higher end units. But we'll see if Grimlock is able to utilise these units well, but I think the Numenorians have got all of the tools necessary to really deal with them, and the worst thing really, we'll move on to the red team temporarily because the red team seem to have thought ahead a little bit more so than the blue team here. They are going to try and double team the dwarves before the elves across the river can assist their allies. Starting off here, Froggy G has got Balagaya Footman on the front line, and they'll be decent at holding the line, but like I said, they're not going to be particularly fantastic when it comes to dealing with that dwarven infantry that we mentioned. The Spear Malice is also going to come into effect, so really they're just going to be there for pinning the dwarven infantry in place, hoping that the elves can come in and do the extra damage that's necessary. And they also have ranged units where the dwarves do not. Balagaya archers in behind, as basic as they may be, the complete lack of ranged units here from the dwarves, which is odd from Erebor. You'd usually expect crossbows, but in this situation the Balagaya archers, as much as the dwarves may be fairly resistant to arrow fire, yeah, going to be a fairly useful tool considering the rather strange lay of the land, and that looks to be that from a Numenorian perspective, which it's a very weird army this. I'm very confused as to what the rules were, and especially seeing as the second battle replay on this list is much more of a conventional siege, but I figured if I was going to show them, I'd have to show them in sequence effectively. Captain Douchebag, what a name, how charming. Blades of Emondwyr and Spears of Emondwyr, I think, are the entirety of his army. And yeah, I'm not seeing anything else. So once again, it's a showdown between basic units only. And these Elven units, especially the Blades of Emondwyr, should actually be pretty good, even against the heavier Dwarven units. But the Spears, maybe a little bit less so, but they can certainly rout off that cavalry. And of course, the armour piercing of the Dwarven Miners not going to be quite so good at dealing with the elves among their ranks. And last but not least, we have Master Blaster. He's the player who sent me this rather odd tug-of-war event, and he's going to be playing as the Elves of Lothlorien. He's going to have to run in order to assist his allies, because the dwarves will not last long, even with certain advantages in melee that they have. They're going to need that support from the Elves of Lothlorien. Spears of the Wood, of course, they offer very much the same sort of things that the ANDUIN units do from Mirkwood. So that very much worth bearing in mind as well. Keren Emerald Staff Masters are an interesting choice, considering their very high melee defense and considering the kind of units that are on display today. The most dangerous thing to them may honestly be the Belagair Archers from Numenor. If they get into melee, they could well be real match winners, even if Lothlorien decide not to help their allies and simply wait till later. A couple of units up here as well, some March Wardens of the Wood, poison projectiles, considering the lower tier nature of all the units on display. Even with these slightly more robust factions, those poison projectiles could very well end up routing off units en masse. We'll see though, not too many archers on display just generally, but a couple of units of March Wardens nonetheless. Some Blades of the Wood back here and more Spears of the Wood, like I said, very similar to the ANDUIN class of units. And then way back over here we have another unit of Blades of the Wood. Perhaps when he can get into the comments and go into the intricacies of what was actually going on with regards to the rules of what could be picked and what couldn't for at least the opening battle here, but we're not going to have to wait for very long. In fact, we're just going to get right down to business here with two factions very, very close to one another, starting off in this narrow valley. We're of course on the Blood Gulch, but we're not going to be seeing this map used in its entirety with such small armies. But without further ado, let's get this show on the road. So I think certainly for the opening of this fight we will go down to half speed, because I imagine things are going to get fairly chaotic, even if they are going to be condensed within this one small area. Now, the dwarves are going to be entirely dependent really on their slightly tougher melee units, and perhaps as well the cavalry, to try and prevent the Mirkwood elves from directly reinforcing the lines of Numenor. If nothing else, this will be a pretty good litmus test of how good the dwarven infantry actually is at its most basic of tasks really, which is to comfortably defeat equivalent, fairly decent quality but ultimately still human spearman, and be able to withstand some of that ranged pressure as well. I think that's going to be vital here. The backup of those miners is also going to be key, and perhaps it's for the best in this battle if Mirkwood were over here, because I do feel as though the compositions, being all things being even in terms of position, would favour, I think, Erebor and Lothlorien, but things are going to get relatively chaotic with Erebor having to deal with two armies at once. The mercenary cavalry burrowing in here to a unit of Belagair archers, but you can already see this is where the mercenary cavalry may very well come unstuck. They are going to prevent the Belagair archers from firing, but that's going to be only a minor victory in the grand scheme of things, I think, given the fact that the Belagair footmen, for the time being at the very least, are withstanding the pressure from the dwarves, though that is very likely to quickly get away from them. But with the elves rushing down from that hillside over there, you would imagine that things are going to turn against the dwarven warriors fairly quickly. And honestly, the mercenary cavalry may be better off going into the backfield and waiting for the elves to arrive and supporting them in that regard, and just seeing how well their infantry can do. As I mentioned, this is a rather strange setup for an initial battle, but it is worth mentioning that this is only the first in a two-part series. There are gaps in this line as well, the Belagair footmen not being pressured from every angle. The dwarves, I think, are actually doing the right thing here by simply buying a bit more time, making sure the elves can't directly surround them. The dwarven miners will find themselves comfortably outclassed by the ANDUIN units that they are challenging in melee here, but they won't mind too much about that, I don't think. All the dwarves need to do is cling on really for as long as they possibly can until Lothlorien arrive, do as much damage as they possibly can as well. To be fair to them, they are trying to use their cavalry here to good effect, but the mercenaries simply aren't going to have enough, I don't think. Mercenary cavalry trying to bulldoze their way through more of the Belagair archers. The mass of cavalry will help them to a certain extent, and with the overlapping of some of these miners as well, maybe the loss of these Belagair archers in decent numbers will give something like the March Wardens of the Wood the impetus later on to try and bring this battle back from the brink for the blue team. We can see here that on the front line as well, the Ironfoot Warriors are going to be... Honestly, I swear to God, every time I sit down to record, that's the only time people decide, now's the time I'm going to get in touch. Now's the time I'm going to blow up your phone. Magnificent. Anyway, as I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, Ironfoot Warriors are going to be doing a real number on these Balagai footmen, so it is up to the Mirkwood Elves to slightly hurry up, and they are doing so now, force pathing some of their spears through, which is going to be the catalyst for the Ironfoot Warriors needing to turn around. They can thinly blanket the front line with Ironfoot Warriors and still do fine against the Balagai footmen after all. And just in behind, Merc Cavalry still running amok, but especially with the Elven spears here, I think the Cavalry's spree is at an end, unfortunately for them. A little bit further back, the Dwarven General does fall. And Lothlorien are certainly not going to arrive in time to help Erebor, and presumably there was no rule against stacking up two armies on one side of the river, so in many ways this is the fault of Lothlorien for leaving their ally high and dry, really. Not having the wherewithal to see what the opposition side was doing, which was definitely the right thing to do, even if it ended up just being a very narrow and clustered 2v2. I think it would have been worthwhile. But as it is, it's not going to be great for them. The Ironfoot Warriors fighting to the death. Lothlorien are going to have to find a wet place to dig in, I think. There's no way they can face the superior numbers that they're going to be tasked with trying to kill off in the open field. A little bit further back, the Blades of ANDUIN as well. Over yonder we have the Dwarven Miners. Balagai archers have taken a fair amount of damage though. They are trying to set up on the high ground once more, and succeeding in doing so. They're firing allegedly at something, which is a sign they're on fire at will, because it means that they're firing at the Dwarven units, and there's no real need for them to do so. In fact, they're far more likely to be wasting ammunition, or even worse, getting friendly fire in for the bargain. But pretty much as you would expect, given the initial setups, this one cluster of Dwarven Miners was doing a fairly decent job. They are shaken now though, trying to get away from the spears of ANDUIN being the real problem in that engagement for them. That unit of Balagai archers has been completely destroyed. This cluster of Ironfoot Warriors are shaken, but fighting hard. You can see the difference between the dwarves facing off against the Balagai spears and the dwarves facing off against the Elven swordsmen. The difference in the efficiency of that engagement is quite frankly massive. But that's why, I guess, that's why they're going to be playing off against one another quite nicely here, the Numenorian and Mirkwood. Compositions, those Balagai archers as the battle enters its latter stages against Lothlorien with their March Wardens. That's where Numenor will really earn their keep. Whereas when it comes down to being involved in this pure melee tussle, that's where Mirkwood are going to have to do the business. At the back, those Balagai footmen still alive, and to be fair, Dwarven Miners are still here in fairly high numbers as well. I still don't think Lothlorien are going to arrive in time. In fact, you know, if they do try and charge forward quickly to save the dwarves, I think all they'll be doing is wasting their time. And unfortunately now we're also going to be seeing them involve themselves in a skirmish fight where they have to take the initiative against Numenor. So far, I think the red team, as long as they maintain their discipline here, should be fine. Units like the Staff Masters may come into their own here though. Very, very difficult to bring down in melee overall. But let's go down to half speed again, because things are going to be getting a little bit stretched once more. Ironfoot Warriors are there, doing the business. The Dwarven Miners, defeat seems certain. The extra damage they do, I mean, if they can kill off as many elves as possible, that's really the best they can hope for at this point, with the last of the Ironfoots overcome, which means Lothlorien most assuredly will not be arriving to any dwarves to rescue, unfortunately for them. Lothlorien, though, are moving forward with intent here, and to be fair, I mean, there are no infantry units protecting the front of these Belagair archers, and this was one of the main units I would suggest that Lothlorien would have been worried about. I mean, it's not exactly been a masterclass in tactical brilliance, this, by either side, but Lothlorien will definitely take this free way back into the battle that Numenor have offered them, really. And now the Belagair archers, of course, are not going to be up to the task of facing off against the grey-clad Lothlorien elves in melee like this, especially not with the staff masters. I would question really what Mirkwood were waiting for down there. They were in a very neat formation, but there's no guarantee that Lothlorien were ever going to politely advance into their prepared formation. Marchwarns of the Wood did take a little bit of damage from the initial skirmish fights that were underway, but now with the Belagair archers engaged, they are now free to try and turn the tables in that regard. Start being the ones to do the damage, which they will need that if they are to get back into the battle, given how poorly the initial stages of the battle went for the blue team. Can Lothlorien make up for leaving their ally in the lurch, really? Because the dwarves are now completely gone by the looks of it. Yep, that is the last miner being executed by the blades of ANDUIN. They really need to just be getting everything in here at this point, because now, with Lothlorien being consolidated and the red team being a little bit scattered, I would worry about their chances moving forwards in this battle.
Only half the enemy force remains.
Staff masters still there. Belagair archers still able to fire as well, so they've still got at least one unit of archers doing the business here, Numenor. But force pathing the staff masters through, and I feel as though the staff masters will really earn their keep here. We've got the large flanking force of ANDUIN units, but not all of them. The stretched nature of this engagement, like 89 spears of ANDUIN being left behind, that is, in the context of this battle, an awful lot of Mirkwood's strength effectively being wasted. Considering these are relatively small armies, you really have no excuse for losing micro on units like that either. Blades of ANDUIN back here are managing to deal with the Marchwardens of the Wood. Some of the Spears of the Wood also there. Point blank shots into the blades. The shields will be doing their job, mitigating a little bit of that damage, but they've only got so long before they get engaged in melee. In this situation you would of course back the dedicated infantry unit over. There's that crazy death animation that happens when infantry gets a clean charge off. It's not something I ever noticed in Vanilla Medieval 2, so it must be something native to Reforged that was part of this patch way back when. We've of course been in this patch so long at this point that it's become the norm, at least in my mind. Blades of the Wood, Haldir, close to combat. His unit is in combat at the very least. His Belagair archers still engaged. Blades of the Wood will cut them down, however. Now the Spears of ANDUIN are arriving, and with the full array of Mirkwood elves now on the front line, this is where Lothlorien may start to struggle once more. You can see in the background there Blades of the Wood hunting down some of the more isolated Belagair archers. At the top of the hill they're still trying to fire at point blank, which to be fair against the staff masters they may as well, because they're not likely to make much of an impression at all in melee. Half of one of the red team armies is gone. I imagine that would probably be Numenor. But their units are also starting to become shaken. Numenor General also falls, so that sort of morale shock may have its impact. Broken and fighting to the death. Considering the kind of units that are on display, after all. Under normal circumstances you'd rate Numenor very highly morale-wise, but when they've only got Belagair units to work with, that ceases to be the case, really. As they flee. Blades of the Wood now moving back down, so very quickly it's turning into a bit of an Elven Royal Rumble. The slightly more reactive composition of Numenor and the isolated nature of Erebor earlier on in this fight means that the Elven allies are the first to fall, and now both factions of Sylvan Elves facing off against one another. Marchwardens of the Wood getting involved in melee as well. Still Balagire archers are alive back here, but getting cut down piece by piece by the Marchwardens of the Wood. And I suppose, given the nature of this fight as a whole, even the most basic of out-of-ammo archers could actually have a huge impact in melee in this fight. This unit of Marchwardens getting chased all over by these Blades of Amenduia. Staffmasters arriving back now. The Amenduia units may be a little bit scattered. This is the strongest section of the battlefield for Lothlorien. Marchwardens coming in here to assist with this engagement. The Staffmasters turning around to face one of the healthier units of Blades of Amenduia that are still on the field. And, I mean, they should win, I suppose, given the lower numbers on those Staffmasters. Further up the hill, things looking better for Mirkwood than even down there. Spear Malice will not help them at all against the Staffmasters, but they're doing their best. And then further back over here, we've still got the Blades of the Wood moving forwards, still hoping to completely finish off Numenor, which is surely in the reckoning now. There goes Thranduil, and even the Elven factions on display today don't have the quality necessary really to prevent morale shocks. The most basic of Elven units getting tired as well. Blades of Amenduia moving in, Spears of Amenduia trying a downhill charge on the Spears of the Wood. And then back over here, bit of a jump there on the charge, trying to gain a bit more momentum before they complete that. There's still some more Numenorians down here as well, which is not a bad effort from them. The Balagire archers just about hanging on in there in this fight, trying to aid the elves in whatever manner they can. Defeat seems certain for the Blades of the Wood. I mean, it's worrying this for Lothlorien. They need to be seeing a decent victory, but I think with this clutch of Mirkwood units that have arrived, more Spears and Blades of Amenduia, I feel as though they are going to be overrun, and this all stems from that initial deployment. I'm a little bit surprised that Lothlorien didn't see that coming, to be honest. It was clearly not against the rules, otherwise this battle never would have been sent to me in the first place. Spears of Amenduia simply holding back the bulk of the Lothlorien reinforcements from arriving. If they can continue to do that, they'll win at the base of the hill. Oh, they shouldn't be doing that though. Oh, actually no, Marchwardens of the Wood with their ammunition. They really can't afford to be letting those poison projectiles do their thing, so well spotted, Captain. Mirkwood turning around with yet more spears. Those Marchwardens wavering. I don't know if they've got the DPS to truly turn things around anyway. Interesting litmus test as well as who's got the better entry-level units of Lothlorien and Mirkwood. I personally would always have rated Mirkwood's a little bit higher. They generally have that little bit more melee defense. Lothlorien, of course, has got more armor, but that only comes into effect really on their higher tier units. So this is more of a natural focus for Mirkwood in comparison to Lorien. And that's why I would give them a slight edge. Blades of the Wood there. Haldir, the only general left alive on the field today. Surely about to be skewered. Although he manages to run one of those elves through with his curved blade. It's turned into a pretty damn chaotic fight. They have managed to get their Marchwardens of the Wood at the top of this hill now. Maybe the poison projectiles can be their saviour. Still a decent resisting force they've got here at the summit of the hill. Blades of the Wood will defeat the spears, of course, the swords not having to deal with the spear malice of their fellows. Spears of Amenduia moving uphill to try and break the line of these Staffmasters and get at those Marchwardens of the Wood. I think based on the amount of Amenduia units that are at the base of the hill still, and the fact they've still got a unit Balagire archers that can counter skirmish. It's been kind of a valiant effort to make up for the being out of position early on Lothlorien, but in the end I think the outcome of this battle is going to be clear for all to see. There we have it. Blades of the Wood, again putting on a brave show of it. Black streaks of those projectiles, having to counter-skirmish with the Balaguer archers, which is honestly not what they would want to be doing in this situation. They would want to be firing into the heart of this infantry force, hoping that those poison projectiles would cause the mass rout that at this point they are basically completely dependent upon. Flanking around as well with the spears of ANDUIN. This is going to be a Mirkwood victory, along with what remains of their Numenor allies. So there we have it. The Marchwarns are also going to be engaged in melee here, perhaps closer than initially I thought it would be based upon how both armies were deployed. But in the end, the expected result has transpired on this rather unique setup for a battle. 26 blades of ANDUIN down at the base of the hill as well, which in the grand scheme of things for a battle like this is actually a fair amount of strength that Mirkwood have still got marshalled back there. Worth saying that Numenor really only have 18 left. The only faction that's going to have a standing force remaining at the end of this one is going to be Mirkwood. Charge there from the Blades of the Wood, trying to kill off the final Balaguer archers as if to try and at least remove Numenor from the field, although Blades of the Wood having to turn around. There goes Haldir, face bloodied as it was. And I think that is going to be that. The final stand of these Blades of the Wood, wavering. They're managing to hold themselves together mentally just that little bit longer. Balaguer archers still there as well, so Numenor do manage to hold on in this fight. They will live to see the end of it. Defeat seems certain. Only a military genius could win this battle. Yeah, I mean, maybe if you have one of your higher tier units available to you rather than having to rely on the most basic unit. But it is what it is. And there we have it. So, the second part of this tug of war will see Lothlorien and the dwarves of Erebor forced back into a Lothlorien settlement, with Mirkwood and Numenor on the attack. Much more of a traditional siege, that one. I have to say, under normal circumstances, based on the layout of this battle, this probably wouldn't have been one that I would have showed, but I mean, it is a little bit different, which breaks up maybe a little bit more of the standard siege battles that we've seen. And the next battle is more of a standard siege, it must be said, in that Lothlorien style settlement, which we will see in the very next battle up. So for context's sake, this one needed to be shown if I was going to show that one. And it is something a little bit different as well. I mean, a very strange battle. I think context is maybe key here, and I'm sure in the comments section maybe Master Blaster can shed some light onto what the initial rules were and why we saw what we saw. But yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to something very simple. The deployment of the red team was simply, thinking ahead far better than the deployment of the blue team. And Erebor, there was only so much they could have done with that sort of situation, and they did a fairly reasonable job, to be honest with you, of trying to do some damage, especially to Numenor. But they weren't going to be able to do anything against an Elven flank, and Lothlorien, they came forward, they tried to do what they could. And they gave a fairly decent accounting of themselves, and with the slightly different unit that was the Staff Masters, it was not a bad effort, but in the end, it was a hole that they dug for themselves, and it wasn't something they could get themselves out of either. So what did the damage for Lothlorien then? Blades of the Wood, 313 kills. Remember that all of these kills are on similar units, so the shape of the engagement really, basically everything. Only a couple of units not breaking 100, one of which was a Staff Master unit, another one was Marchwarns of the Wood, but kind of hard to use the archers in the position that they were in as the battle wore on into its latter stages. So I don't really blame Master Blaster too much for that, but yeah, we shall see if they can avenge their defeat when it turns into a more traditional siege battle next time around, with Lothlorien dug into one of their settlements with a bit of Dwarven steel to back them up. Bit of an odd one this, like I said, not usually the sort of thing I would show, but a tug of war is the sort of thing which maybe you don't see an awful lot of these days. It was definitely back in the day the sort of thing that you would see here and there, but not so much now, so it is at least interesting to see the concept be dusted off by someone. But next time we shall see if the pendulum can swing back the other way or not. But yeah, big thank you to Master Blaster for sending this rather unique one in, and next time around we shall see where this path leads. Big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of this battle replay. And now I have a train to catch, so I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.